Holy Gospel is written in the first chapter of St. Mark, beginning at the 21st verse. Jesus and his disciples went to Capernaum. When the Sabbath came, he entered the synagogue and taught. They were astounded at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority and not as one of the scribes. Just then there was in the synagogue a man with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be silent and come out of him." And the unclean spirit, convulsing him and crying out with a loud voice, came out of him. They were all amazed, and they kept on asking one another, "What is this? A new teaching with authority? He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him." And at once his fame began to spread throughout the surrounding region of Galilee. Here ends the gospel for the day. Please be seated. As I started to do the preparation for this text for this morning, I was able to round up about eight sermons that dealt with this text. And out of those 8 sermons, there was only one of them that dealt really with the central item that's involved in this text. And I read the preface to this in your bulletin. The forces that would bring death and disease have taken hold of man, and yet they recognize Jesus and know what power means for them. Jesus commands these forces to leave, and people are amazed at his authority. Those 7 sermons that I talked about the authority of Jesus, and didn't really mention anything about the fact that this is an exorcism. It's casting out a demon. I guess it's best if we can just sidestep that and not deal with it. And I really wanted to do that too. Because how do you relate demon possession to people in the 21st century in a small Lutheran congregation who probably don't believe that such a thing exists? But it's a scripture. And my task this morning was to take it and work with it and see how we could relate it. Because I really think it does relate to every single one of us. If you look at the Interpreter's Dictionary, the Biblical Interpreter's Dictionary, there are 8 solid pages defining the progression of the word demon in biblical literature. And I could spend the rest of the day talking about those various interpretations, but basically in terms of Jesus, I guess the concept of the demon as some kind of spirit, a lesser deity, which was the definition of a demon at that time, probably what he was referring to in this text in Mark. The possibility of a demon at that point was it could be a good demon or it could be a bad one. It was simply a lesser deity in the minds of the people and their superstitions. But Jesus knew there was something in that person that was creating a disruptive life, and there was a healing experience. The idea of the unclean spirit or demon as some kind of spirit, actual spirit, is still very much alive today. As I was reading about this, it was interesting to note that in September of 1997, Mother Teresa actually the Bishop of Calcutta, asked for an exorcism for Mother Teresa just before she died. I don't know if that had anything to do with the fact that Mother Teresa had expressed some ideas that she at times had doubts about the existence of God was what precipitated this movement on the part of the bishop. But he thought that Mother Teresa needed to have a devil cast out before she died. There are still exorcists within the Catholic Church. There still is there's a ritual for exorcism in the Catholic Church. The numbers I read were somewhere around 10, but in Italy as many as 300. In evangelical churches, Protestant churches, there are somewhere estimated between 500 and 1,000 exorcists that do nothing but cast out demons. Have I ever seen an exorcism? As a matter of fact, I have. I was at a Pentecostal church and I was doing the study in 1965 on speaking in tongues. And we went to place after place where they had the emphasis on faith healing and speaking in tongues and exorcism. And during the one service, as the sermon was going on, somebody in that congregation got up and started speaking in an indistinguishable language. And somebody else stood up and said, "That person is a demon, let's take him out in the narthex and cast out the demon." Which they did. And brought him back in. Sermon started again, and again somebody else got up, said some words that were indistinguishable. They took him out, cast out the demon. It's kind of a scary thing to watch. And going back, I was talking with the 4 people that I was with, and we were talking about the experience we'd had. We didn't really know how to deal with it. How do you deal with it? But you look at the newspapers, you look at the newscasts every single morning, and you see another person shot, somebody stabbed to death, the complete destruction of countries. And you say, certainly there is evil among us. How do you deal with it? How do you explain it? I think probably the secular society is a way of explaining demons that really makes sense in the church and really speaks to us very concretely. I'm involved in 2 courses right now, one on banned books and one on the history of English literature. And it is amazing to see how many biographies of some of the great writers are explained in terms of a demon that they couldn't deal with in their life and was so instrumental in how their literature comes out. Like, for instance, in the writer of Frankenstein. But recently, we have a person that was very much a part of our culture, who now is getting a lot of writing about his life. It's Matthew Perry. And recently they found out that his death was caused by an overproduction, an overdose of a particular kind of drug that his body could not tolerate. One of the things that they talk about is that Matthew Perry wrestled constantly with his demons. In his case, alcohol and drug abuse, for the most part. But the last one I read now talked about his abusive behavior and manipulative behavior to his friends and his partners. In 2021, he took a coffee table and threw it had his then fiancée because she talked to him about his infidelity. In 2020, one of the people who was struggling with him in addiction, Megan Moses, who was actually sober at the time, was thrown against the wall when she said that Matthew wasn't doing his part and was lying about his sobriety in his promoting of his book, talking about what he was doing to help others in their grief. The last biographer said this: Matthew Perry wasn't a nasty person, but he was so wrapped up in addiction and his demons that he wasn't himself and the man he should have been. But isn't that the case of every one of us? That somehow we're never nasty, even though we are condescending, we're judgmental, we are hateful, spiteful, resentful, but we're never nasty. It's just, we're not being us then. And we say, oh yes, very much so. That is a part of us. The problem is that we have to keep the demons at bay and at least admit to their existence and come back at the end of the day and confess them to Jesus, and then they might be able to be exorcised. In the Broadway play, Wicked, one of the residents of Oz says to the good witch, Glenda, "What causes wickedness?" And she responds by saying, "Oh, that's a good question. That's confusifying for everybody." That's her word, not mine. I don't think Webster has that one. Perhaps, she says, we are born with it. Or perhaps wickedness is thrust upon us by our culture, by our teachers, by parents, by siblings, by our friends. My mother had an explanation. I don't know if your mother was the same, but she told us, us kids, that the devil was constantly around us, trying to make us do wrong things. And we had a conscience, and that was given to us by God, and that was the defense we had against the devil. And I remember every time my little brother did something wrong, and he did things more wrong than the other two of us particularly did together. But she'd say, "Now, Eric, what made you do this?" And he would say the right answer: "The devil made me do it." I don't know if that resonates with any of your parents' teaching, but that's the theological background that I grew up in. But the church has an answer for this. The Lutheran Church has an answer for it. It's called original sin. Very much a part of the official belief of this church and almost every denominational church in the world. That because man sinned, death and sin came into the world, and there is only one solution to the sin, and that's a firm belief in the existence of God and clinging to the cross of Jesus Christ. But man has the propensity to do wrong, and he does. And see, that's the one chief complaint about those Christians, those non-Christians that criticize us. They say we aren't very legitimate. We're hypocrites. And very often they've got a good reason for saying that, because we don't always do what we say we profess. But we say that's not us. That's not really who we are. But the gospel tells us if we're going to get rid of it, we're going to have to admit it. And that's where confession and forgiveness comes in. That's why the sacrament of the altar is there. because you really can't tell who's really controlled by evil forces or evil spirits, who is not. One of the writers for the New Yorker magazine was a girl by the name of Hannah Arendt. She was a survivor of the Holocaust during World War II. She came to America in 1941, and she began to become a writer. And one of the things she covered were the Nuremberg trials of the Nazis after World War II. She attended the trial of Adolf Ehrlichman. And she said, this person is responsible for the death of 10 million Jews. And one of the things that she said was, what was surprising to me is how normal he was. How absolutely morally ambiguous and neutral he was. It was easy to understand him as a next-door neighbor at your barbecue. He was nice. He didn't even seem anti-Semitic. And when he was asked, why did you do these things? He said, it was my job. I don't know if you know that in most of the executions by electric chair, they have 3 switches, 3 people called to do the execution. Because people have some strong feelings about death and killing somebody, 2 of them are duds. Only one really works. But they don't want people to know who's really responsible. Because you can always walk out and say, it's a 2/3 chance that it wasn't me. One of the things the Bible tells us is that we call the demons by name. They were called by names. In the 5th chapter of Mark, the whole chapter really deals, the first half of the chapter deals with another exorcism. And that devil is named. It said Legion. And he called Legion because I guess there was a multitude of demons in that exorcism. But we know the words that really are the demons that torture us. And all of us have them to a certain degree. Unrelenting competition. Expressions of rage and violence. 2 demons. We have a new one, road rage. A new devil. Arrogance. Self-righteousness. 2 common demons, somewhat alive in every single one of us. The demon that says there's only one way to worship or express spirituality. Depression, guilt, unresolved guilt. We did something 20 years ago that we're still beating ourselves up for, instead of turning it over to God, letting Him forgive it. Despair, fear, anxiety, compulsive behavior. I can't control what I'm doing. Hate, envy, resentment, unforgiveness, and the desire for revenge. I don't get mad, I get even. I don't like to preach this sermon. It's as close to the hellfire and brimstone as I ever get. I like to talk about grace. And this text does wind up with grace. It says not that you shouldn't ever feel that you're guilty of any of these things, but you should look at yourself, particularly when you come to the Holy Supper, and say, these are my demons. Will you please forgive them? Will you pull them out of me It is a constant battle. And the message of Mark this morning is, he called the demons out and helps you to overcome them. 2 weeks ago when I spoke at another church, the minister there had a gift that he got. And it was from one of his admirers in the congregation, and it was a string of ducks. And the purpose of that was to tell him, you got all your ducks in a row. If I could, no, I wouldn't. But maybe we should have a string of our demons up before us and just make sure you got them all in a row and under control. But if not, God will call them out. Amen. Sermon hymn, Oh, for a Closer Walk with Thee, 103 in your book.